All right, so we have this little app. You may or may not already have looked at this. It's code that I put on GitHub. It's a really simple little app. If we look at the structure of it, it's just an app.js. And inside the app.js, I have two pages. And I use the word pages with air quotes because they're not really pages, they're just components. But I'm treating them like pages. In my post, you may have noticed I also mentioned that there is a way to have a multi-page app without actually using something like React Router. And that's what I did here. And I'll do that in a second. But I have two pages. I have this login page and I have an info page. Right now, the login page is showing right here on the browser. And inside each of those pages, my login page, I have a counter. Why? Because who doesn't love counters? So we have a counter inside each of these pages, and they work just like a regular counter. I also have one in the info page. And to run my app, I just have to log in, and my app is really the dumbest login ever. It will accept anything you type anytime. So I'll just say Lighthouse, and it logs in. It says you're logged in, and I have my counter here. This is my info page. So there's really just two main components of my app, which I just call pages, but they're just components. And a small little component called a counter inside each one of them. Log out and log in. Okay, so let's take a quick look at those. There's not much to see. So if you notice here, I've got a calling my login and my info page, and I'm using conditional rendering. Remember we talked about that in the scheduler app? We did it, of course, with just a little appointment component, but we can use it with anything. In this case, I'm using it for the whole page. So if my auth is false, I just have a state called auth here, and it can be true or false. It starts off as false. If auth is false, it's going to show my login page. If auth is true, it's going to show my info page. So I've just done conditional rendering on a multi-page app using two components controlled by some little switch. This could be page. You could have, what's the page? Well, page is page one, page is page two, or you could do a couple pages. I wouldn't recommend this for more than just a handful of pages because it can get unwieldy after a while. The scheduler app, I think we had maybe 5, 6-ish different states. That's kind of as many as you want to use for this kind of thing. Any more than that, you can use something like React Router. But for a couple of small pages, this is not a bad choice. I'm just toggling this auth on and off based on the result of my login, and it conditionally renders my two pages. So if I'm logged in, my login button actually just sets off to true there. And when it re-renders, auth is now true. It does not render a login. It renders my info page. No magic happening here. Okay, and that's not really the core of what we're doing here. This is more of a discussion on using the context API. But I just want to mention this is a simple way you can do multi-page apps if you only got a couple pages. Inside each of my two pages, and I put them in a folder called pages just because I felt like it. They're just components. I have an info component / page and a login component / page. The info page just shows info of the user. So you are logged in and some stuff about them, email, test, just some random stuff. It also has a counter in it, which I'll talk about in a second. The login page is what you'd expect. It has a form. So it has a couple of inputs. It looks kind of complicated, but it's just a form with a submit button. And then with the email and password that I have in state. And when you hit on submit, it's going to call a login function that was provided by my app.js because my state is pulled up, it needs it. So I have the user and the auth in my app.js, and that is then provided to both of these pages. Notice I'm passing the login function, which is here, passing that down to my login page because it needs it. When I click login, it'll call my login page. And as you can see, it doesn't do any checking. It simply says, yeah, you're good. Set auth to true, auth being my state, and then set some dummy variables just for fun. So once again, the dumbest login possible, but it could be something more complex. So I'm passing that to my login component. I'm passing the log out function, which is here, which just clears my state, to my info component. And I'm also passing the current user, which I have here in state. So looking at our structure again, the state is kept inside app, and it provides it to both these pages with props. This is the way we're used to seeing it. We pass props down to this. Okay. Inside my info and login page, I have a counter just sitting there, kind of hanging out there in space, but there. And this counter is, as we'd expect, just has a number, some buttons, and some functions to change its state. Right now, each one of these counters is self-contained. In other words, it has its own state. So this counter here has its own state. When I log in, this is a different counter. It has its own state. When I log out, of course, it's not going to go back because the component was destroyed on the previous render, so it has to rebuild the component, so it starts at 0. So not only are these two counters not related, whenever I re-render the page, I get a brand new counter with a brand new state because the state belongs to the component. So when the component's destroyed, its state is destroyed as well. It's gone. What I want to have happen, this is my goal, is I want to have my counter in my login page. When I log in, I want that state to stay the same. I want to have inherited the state. So I have two components sharing the same state without props. That's my goal here, which I don't have right now. How can I make this happen? Well, we talked in the second week of our React about custom hooks. That's an option. We could make ourselves a custom hook, a use counter. We can try that. Let's try that. So we're going to just edit really just our, right now, our counter. And we know it's really easy to make a custom hook, isn't it? We simply make a file, make a folder called hooks. There we go. And make ourselves a file called useCounter.js. Right. And to do this, we've done this before in use application data. We just really just copy and paste. It's actually quite easy. We take everything to do with the counter itself, the logic of the counter itself, not their displaying, but the logic. We pull out that logic and put it in this file. So we're going to make a function there. We'll call it useCounter. Okay. All right. And it's got use state. I'm going to use my auto import because I love doing that. There we go. Okay. So I have a useCounter function. All right. It's almost done. I mean, that's almost it. All I have to add to my useCounter hook is to return something. Right now, it has all this cool logic, but it's not being exposed. So I probably should return that. So I'm just going to return an object with whatever it is that I'm interested in exposing. In this case, I'm interested in exposing the counter itself and probably the functions, the increment, decrement, and clear functions that we've all grown to know and love in our many weeks of looking at counters over and over again. Okay, so now I've pretty much got a functioning custom hook. I just have to export this. So I'll just export my, here we go, and use counter. There we go. So now I have a counter that I can use, right? A counter hook that I can use inside a counter. And I've abstracted the state logic. That's what I'm trying to get away from, trying to abstract the state logic away from the counter itself and ultimately make the state logic completely separate so it's shared. And this is step one. So now I can go ahead and probably remove all this logic. I don't need to have any state logic inside my counter, do I? Because the state's being handled by the hook. Instead, I can simply, in my counter, I can use my hook. And we know to do that, we simply go const and we use our counter. I want to counter, like let's just copy it. It's actually easier. I'm going to copy the whole thing because it looks identical every time. There, I'll copy that. Equals use counter. Is it going to find it for me? Let's take a look. Is my auto? Oh, it is. I love auto import. use counter. There. Now I've pulled all the logic out of my counter components into a hook. So it's got use counter. And these functions are now available, as is the counter. So nothing's changed here. I've just pulled the logic. And we've done this before. We just pull some functional logic or some usually state logic out of our component and put it in a file and stick the word use in front of it. And voila, we have a custom hook. It's dirt simple. Okay. And I have a counter that still works. Plus, 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 minus, minus, minus. Let's log in. But as we know, and as we learned in our lecture on custom hooks, multiple instances of the same custom hook do not share state. Like, oh, so this doesn't solve all of our problems. It's made our counter a lot simpler. I mean, that's pretty easy. But it didn't solve our actual problem, did it? We still don't have shared state. If I go to here, if I go log out, the counter is still destroyed. When it renders again, it does a brand new use counter, gets a brand new state, and starts over again at 0. So no joy there yet, but we're getting close. Right. This is where our really cool React hook called useContext, or the context API, comes in. And it's almost magic. As I mentioned before, when I first discovered this, I said to myself, I've died and gone to heaven. This is amazing. I can use this everywhere. This is so cool. Let's take a look at it. You may or may not have had an advanced lecture on the context API. Sometimes we do in the West, sometimes not, but we'll go through it. It's pretty simple. I'm not going to go into detail how it works because there's not much to it. It's like a couple of lines of code you have to add. So what I'm going to do instead, I'm going to do what's called a context provider. So I'm going to make myself a little file again. So there we go. And I'm going to make myself a folder for providers. You don't have to. I oftentimes do, called providers. It's, by the way, it looks a lot like a hook, like an awful lot like a hook, but it's called providers. Providers. There. Oh, actually, my source. There we go. Now I have a folder called providers. I'm going to make myself another file. Now I have use counter in my hook. It's going to be counter provider. For lack of a better name, I'll call it a counter provider. And by the way, this is a component. So it's going to be capital C counter provider.js. So it's going to be a component that's going to be my counter provider. Now it's going to look an awful lot like my custom hook. So I can almost take most of the logic out of it. But let's just build ourselves a simple component first. So we'll export default. We'll call it function. Come on. We'll call our counter provider. We're just building a functional component. I'm just adding the export default in front of it because I'm lazy, right? Okay, so equals counter provider, which may or may not take props. That's kind of optional. Okay, so we all know the definition of a React component, don't we? A React component is a function that returns JSX. So we have half of that. We have a function. So in order to qualify as a React component, it should probably return some JSX. So we'll just say return. And we'll use our round brace to make our life easy. And we'll for now, just give it a fragment. There. Okay, the world's simplest React component. Literally does nothing. Just happens to be called counter provider. Okay, we will get to this part later. A lot of cool stuff happens right there. But let's just get our logic. Our logic really stays the same. So we're going to go to our use counter. We use the exact same logic. Because we want the same stuff, don't we? We want all the same state, but now it's going to be inside our new component called a counter provider. There. And I'll go ahead and import my use state again. There we go. Okay. So once again, it's got a counter. This is now our shared state. This is the state that's going to be shared between anyone who uses our counter provider. Function, increment, decrement, clear, the same old guys. And let's go back to our hook. We use almost the same syntax, but we don't now return this object because we have a return. A component has to return JSX. What we do want to do is we want to have this as a data object. So I can call it anything. I'm going to call it my, so const data equals. This is what I'm exposing there. Okay, so this is kind of the skeleton of my provider. It's just a component, nothing magic happening here. It's a component. It's got some state. I'm building myself a little object that's going to contain the things I want to expose to the outside world. All four of them right there. Okay. All I have to do to make this into an actual context API provider is do two things. The first thing I need to do is what's called the React create context function. It's a top level React function. I have to create myself an object to use. I'll put it outside my component. So I'm going to, and I have to export that. So export const, and I'll call it my counter context. There's literally like 2 or 3 lines of code we add, and this becomes amazing provider. So I'm going to call the create context, and auto import works. Create context there, no parameters. Now I've created a context. I have a React context that I can use, and these things are awesome. So I've got this. I need to expose this outside because any component that needs to use a context has to first import this. Okay, so I have this context. Now context, we need to use this as, or use the provider of this context. So remember we talked about, we'd get back to this component a little bit later. Well, this is what's going to happen here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to, instead of using a fragment, I can use a special component that is built into a context. When you call create context, you get an object, and that object has what's called a provider component built into it. So I can go counter context dot, and it has a provider. Provider. Come on, spell correctly. There. Okay. So it's actually a special component built into your context that you create. It's called provider. It is a component, and it can be handled or treated just like any other component. So there's my provider. And I'm going to add one attribute to it, value equals, and it's going to be my data. There. So this is how we use it. We create ourselves a context. We then use that context provider as a component in our return, and we say value equal the thing or stuff we want to expose using an object. It could be an array, using an object. Okay. So now we have a component. One last little piece of magic that you've seen before. We're now going to use this counter context component, and we are going to wrap stuff in it. We want to wrap, for instance, the counter or the counters, or maybe all of our counters in this counter provider. And to do that, we have to make sure we do this. Just props.children. There. So if I use this component, it'll become obvious in a second. Anything that it is wrapped around will end up being here. So if I wrapped my login page in my counter context, the login page would be inside my provider. And what happens is anything wrapped by my provider has access to all my state. It'll become more clear in a second. So a little bit of magic here. Really, you can copy and paste. This is the same for any provider, right? And this is all you have to do. It doesn't get any more complex than this, other than you might have more functions. You might have a more complex state. You can have multiple providers. I just have a counter. I could have a counter provider, maybe an auth provider, maybe a could have a user provider, all kinds of cool stuff. I just have a counter provider because they're easy. So let's look how we'd use this thing. So really, this was almost like a custom hook. It wasn't a custom hook, but it's a component with some logic. I added 2 lines. I added that line there, a context that I can import and export, and I added this component with this little magic line to wrap some children. So I didn't do much to it. Let's go ahead and use our counter provider. So how do I use it? Well, let's take a look. Let's go back to our app.js here. So what I really want to have happen is I want to have this to not come from my hook. I want this to come from my provider, don't I? I really want to get this, or these functions, that object, from my counter provider. And to do that, we have to first wrap any component we want to have access to state in our provider, which is not as hard as it sounds. I'll put this right, I'll put it right here. So counter provider, there we go. Let's see, can I import my counter provider? And let's put an end to it right here. And there, okay. I'm wrapping pretty much everything in my provider. So everything below here, remember we talked about props.children? These are the props.children. Remember that special prop you can use? It's called props.children. That's them. So these now show up in my provider as that. Okay. So that's it. I've now allowed any component underneath here to have access to my state. And how does that work? Well, login has that, but login doesn't care about the counter. It doesn't need the state for counter, but the counter, which is one below my login, does need it. So I don't need to pass my prop of my counter down now. I can go directly to my counter, and my counter can access that state directly with 2 lines of code. So now it doesn't need this hooks anymore. Instead of that, it's going to import the counter context. Context. It's going to find it. Ooh, it did. Wow. From providers. There we go. There, I've got the context. The only other step I need to do is to use context. This is the new hook that we have. Use context is an amazing hook. It is one of those top level hooks. It's right up there with use state, use effect, use context. Those are the big 3. We didn't talk much about use context, but this is like the 3rd leg of the chair, I guess. It is a huge, amazing hook, and it's going to be use context. And what context do I want to use? I want to use the counter context. Just like that. There. That's all. That's all you have to do to allow any component anywhere down the tree to have access to your state. 2 lines. You simply import the context, and then you use it. And then you decide what pieces of the object you want to use. In this case, I want to use them all. I want to use all these things, the functions and the states. I want to use them all. Great. So this should still work. I mean, it's compiling. My hook is not used anymore, so it's totally out of the picture. Let's see if this works. I'm really curious. So let's go to 5. Let's log in. Look at that. It's still 6. It now has shared state. So these 2 counters are now accessing the same state, even though, if you look at our code, they're not even in the same tree. Like they're totally, this is like, there's our login, they're totally in a different tree. So login and info, they're below, they're at totally different branches of the same tree, but because they're all wrapped by counter provider, it has access to any state that counter provider provides. It really is magic. It just seems too good to be true. It works. In fact, it works for the children, grandchildren, any component down the tree as far as you want to go. I could have components all the way down here. There, as far as you want to go. It doesn't matter. they can all do that simple call to import the context, use context, decide what they want to use, and they have access to everything that was provided by my provider, which is right there. Real simple. I mean, once you get the hang of it, the really only trick to this is this props.children, which we haven't used a lot in our React yet, but we did talk. I think we touched on it the first couple of days. Props.children is a special prop that lets you just put the content. So right there, that is our props.children. Everything else is the context API. So we have shared state, which is awesome. So I go to 10, I log out, it's still 10. The state, of course, is now separate. So even though, yes, these counters were destroyed because of conditional rendering, the state that they talked to was not destroyed. The state was off to the side. Actually sitting in app is what it really is doing. So now the state sits inside this provider right there. So you can decide, you don't have to wrap the whole app. You can only wrap a couple of things. Or in this case, I'm wrapping pretty much the whole app in my counter provider. By the way, if you decide or you forget to wrap something, what can happen is this. Let's just go here and let's only wrap our login component in our provider. But let's say we forgot to wrap our info component in our counter provider. The rule is, if you want to have access to your shared state, where's our page? There we go, info. If you want to do your, oh, sorry, counter, there it is. This counter is doing use context and import. If you want to do use context, whatever component's doing the use context has to be wrapped. Let's see what happens if it's not wrapped. So the second counter, we know the second counter is in here, don't we? We go there, we log in, we're going to get a nasty error, which is really no help at all from React. It's like object is like, it just really doesn't help you. It kind of says, yeah, I guess use context, but it's unlike most errors, it's not a very helpful error, is it? It does tell you that, yeah, your use context didn't work. What happened was I can't do use context because this particular counter, the one inside my info, was not wrapped in my counter context. So I can't do this. So if you get this error, this means you probably forgot to wrap something in it and needs to be wrapped. That's all. Now it's wrapped, I can log in, and there we go. So the question is, your login and info are both rendered from the same app? Yes. Can you use this counter in multiple locations? Sure. Why not? Sure. It's a component. Who cares? Yeah. But it'll be a different provider. So for instance, if I was to make two of these there and then another one, what do you think is going to happen now? There. Great. What do we think is going to happen? Let's take some, anyone want to guess what's going to happen here? To context, it's going to, well, define work, right? Define, it's going to work, but how is it going to work? Let's take a look how it works. Let's set our counter to 10, 8, 9, 10. We're going to log in and back to 0. Okay, let's go to 8, log out, back to 10. It worked. Didn't work exactly like we were hoping, or maybe it did, I don't know. They each have their own state. So each of these providers is separate. So yes, it's shared state. I mean, it's not just being destroyed. The state is still there, but they get their own state. Exactly. Two wrappers have two states. Exactly correct. And so works, you know, I wouldn't, maybe I want to do this. Depends on the, I mean, it depends on your design, right? So you can certainly use multiple instances. This is a component. I mean, I can put components anywhere. It's just, it's not anything magic. It's just a component. Okay. So yes, if I wrap each container, they'll be independent. Yes, so they will have separate states, but they'll be shared states, and any component underneath will still share that wrapper state. So there may be a situation where you want to do that. It makes total sense. In this case, I'm just, for simplicity, wrapping everything in that. Okay. So it is really, really cool. Now let's do one more thing that you may have a, let's do a more real life example of how you might use this. So let's go here. You notice my login. I have all this logic here. I have my state here. but I have to pass props. By the way, you notice there's no props, is there? Let's go to our login. See, no props. There's no props happening here. So it's my counter has no props, but it's getting shared state. Let's do the same thing with our login. Let's see if we can remove the props from login and from info. So there's login, there's our info. These are more complicated. Can we remove all the props from both of those and work everything off shared state? The answer is yes, we can. So what we need now is we need another provider. It's not counter, it's some kind of login or authentication or user provider. So we'll make a new one. Let's make a new one. We'll call it providers. I'll call it my auth provider. By this is a very useful pattern that I use in a lot of my code. Oh, sorry, it's a component, so it has a capital A. Okay, I have an auth provider. Okay. Any questions so far, by the way, on how this is working? Takes a little bit of getting used to, but there really is only a small bit of code, and you are welcome to grab the GitHub project that I have, and there are multiple branches that step you through the whole process we're going through today. Of course, is Redux similar? The answer is kind of yes, kind of no. And I'll talk about that at the end and how it's different from Redux. Kind of similar, but kind of not. So I know it's not a very satisfying answer, but I'll get into that later. So, okay, I'm going to make myself a auth provider. Now I could go to the, do the same thing, make an auth hook, but I'm not going to bother. I go straight to the provider. So, okay, let's make ourselves, in fact, I'm just going to copy because I'm lazy. I'm going to copy my context provider. I just don't feel like typing a lot, but I'm going to rename it. I'm going to call this an auth context. Here we go. I'm going to call this, so I can't use any of my counter stuff. There. And I got my auth context. Looks good. Okay, and of course I got my, where's my function? This is going to be an auth provider now. So this is called an auth provider. Great. All right, does the same thing. This code didn't change, did it? This is like boilerplate. This can literally stay the same, as can most of this, apart from the part you're exporting. And I'm not quite sure what I'm exporting yet. So, okay. So there's kind of a boilerplate for a context provider component. So let's go to our, I think it's app.js. I think I put everything in there, didn't I? So let's go there. And there's my state. So here's my state that's doing all the interaction with my authentication stuff. User, login, logout. So it's just this logic here. So I can take that logic because the state that deals with authentication is the true false and the user. And I have two functions that interact. Remember with the counter, we had a number and three functions, increment, decrement, clear. So the key to writing these contexts or even custom hooks is you have some state and you have some functions that interact with that state. So I'm taking anything at all that interacts with that state, I'm going to yank it out and put it inside my new context, my new provider. There we go. Great. Okay, that was easy. Same thing, copy and paste. Well, guess what next? My only step remaining is what? Expose these, I guess, 4 things now. That's all. I want to expose these things to the outside world. And my work's done. So I'm going to expose my auth, my actual, like my true false. I'll expose my user so they can have that. And like my 2 functions, login and logout. And I've now written a provider. Wasn't very hard, was it? I simply, this middle part, this is like the meat of the sandwich. This is pretty much the same bread here and here. It's just your state interactions is kind of the good part of the sandwich right in there. Stuff that happens with state. So now I have some shared state. I have an auth provider. Well, now I can use this somehow. Let's take a look. So I'm going to do the same thing inside my login. I'm going to have my login, instead of getting props now, props.login, that's all it needs, I guess. I am now going to, now this state, these are needed. This is like for the form, so I can't touch those. but props.login, that is the function that I'm going to replace. I'm going to instead, I want to import my, so import auth context. Oops. It's going to find it. Let's take a look. Look at that. Import auth context. I might have said capital A. Let's take a look. There we go. Okay. All right. There's my auth context from auth provider. Okay. Now, our next step, because there was only 2 lines of code, wasn't it? We simply use our context. So I'm going to const and whatever I'm exposing, and I'm exposing all these things. But really, a login page, what does it need? It just needs login. I don't need all this stuff, do I? I just need the login. So I'm just going to import login. There. Okay. Equals use context. What context? I'm now going to use the auth context. Let's see what happens if I do this. Okay. Great. Great. Okay. Oh, object is not defined. Okay. Pop quiz. Why am I getting this object's not defined? Remember this unhelpful error from before? Why am I getting object is undefined? And it's saying it's happening on my use context line. Let's take some guesses. Export. Well, let's take a look. No, it's exported. I'm exporting here. Any otherwise? Not wrapped. Oh, got it. Good catch. Of course, my login is not wrapped yet by my auth provider. So we have to wrap it. Notice our app.js. It's wrapping the stuff, right? So yeah, everything's wrapped in there. This is great. So these components have access to the state of that counter provider. I need to also wrap my login and info, or at least my login, in this auth provider. So there's a couple ways I can do that. I could put it here. Nothing wrong with this. I could go, let's go auth provider. There we go. And put it here. I could do this. And that would kind of work. Kinda. So I do have it here. Okay. And if I log in, but the problem is what's happening is I'm using a different user. By the way, I can take what's away. I can now take out that prop. So this is working. This part's working fine, right? My login function no longer needs props and it still works. So I don't need props. I'm just going to call my login function there. So this works fine. Okay. The problem is, let's go here. Okay. We log in. It doesn't do anything. Why? Because even though I'm calling the login function in my provider and it's setting auth true, it's setting this auth to true, and our app.js has its auth up here, and this is the auth that's being used as our conditional rendering. Oh no. So we need to have our context wrapping more of this, like the whole app. Yeah, exactly. We need to wrap the whole app component, like kind of like this. Like, we kind of need this, don't we? Kind of this. Sort of. That's what we need. So now this auth also comes from our use context. Well, of course, this doesn't work. We can't do this. This is bad, just totally bad. React doesn't work. Can't do it. So, but it's what we need. So can anyone suggest a way we could, in fact, wrap our entire app component in our auth provider? Any suggestions? Oh, again, some great suggestions. Yes, we could use the index.js because, as it turns out, the app.js is not the top of your app, is it? I mean, we're used to using it all the time, but we know that's not really the top of our app. The actual top is, as is correctly pointed out, our index.js And there's our app. Look at that. Well, this looks like a fantastic target that we can wrap with stuff. It's a component. So let's do that instead. Let's go and take our auth provider, take that, get rid of that. And instead of wrapping it, we'll go into our index and wrap our entire app in our auth provider. Can I do an auto import? Yes, I can, like that. Okay, like that. There. And that goes there, and that goes there. Okay, great. Well, now my entire app has access to all of my auth provider, the whole thing. So my app doesn't need it anymore, so I don't need to have my provider there, and that's there. So now we know that we can do the same thing. We can, just like did in the counter, we can import our context. In this case, it's the auth context, because now app is a component that is a child of our main index or our main React component. So it has access to the thing, the whole import the context and use the context. So I could do the same thing, import auth context from that. So we can import that, and now we can use it. So now instead of these two things being like this, instead we can say const, and what do we need? We need the user. Actually, we need the auth. We need the user. Anything else we need? That's all we need. Not sure. I think that's all we need is the, or just the auth. I don't need user. Just need the auth. There. I don't need the user at this point in time. I just need the auth because all I'm using here is auth. So, so const equals use context. And which context to use? I'm going to use my auth context. There, just like that. And now this can all go away because that's coming from my context. I don't need the user here anyways. It's only here to be passed down to info. Who cares about that, right? So I can simply remove all of this here. I'll leave in user here just for now because I'm passing as a prop. I don't want to blow my code. So, okay. But all the stuff can go away now. There we go. So now I have my, oh, I need the logout just for now. Since I'm passing logout there. Okay. All right. So now I have everything wrapped in this auth provider, and I'm getting these three things, of which these are temporary. I'm going to remove these later. So now I have my login function with no props at all. That's kind of cool. Let's take a look. Let's go to our login function. It is now calling us. Let's see if it works. Take a look. It appears working. Test. It is working. So now I have managed to completely remove my props from my login. Great, no props, which is like, we all love that, right? Like no props. If I never see a prop as long as I live, it'll be too soon. Anyone said that to themselves? Like no props? Yes. So great. So I've now eliminated props from my login. Let's do the same thing for our info page. At least exactly the same thing. Let's copy our code. Same thing. We'll import our auth provider, and we're going to go ahead and do the same thing. We're going to import this from our context. So we'll use our context. Notice we have these two things. We don't need these anymore. So instead, we'll do this, login and user. We don't need these two anymore. There's no props there. In fact, I think log out I need. There. And no props, because my info page just needs two things. It needs logout and the user. That's all it cares about. It doesn't need login. It doesn't need the auth. It just needs logout user. So there's no point bringing everything in. I just destructured just those two things. And that's it. That's all the change I need. So now I've taken away the props from the info page and the login page. And I literally have pretty much no props in my entire application. Let's see if it works. one more thing. I'm going to go to my app.js again and just quickly clean up that last bit. I think I left some props in there. I did. Those are no longer needed. There. Okay. Now this is a propless app, so to speak. Let's see if it works. Okay, log in. Oh, use context undefined. Oh, forgot to call it. Let's go to our info page. Probably just didn't do an import. We didn't. Control space. There we go. All's forgiven. Okay, try it again. And there we go. It is an necessary counter. We'll go to 7. We'll go to 8. And our app is working with absolutely no props at all. As I said before, when I first saw this, I thought, holy crap, this is amazing. I'm using this like for the rest of my life forever in React. Now, it has its place. You know, props still have their place, and we'll talk about the pros and cons of useContext. But really, for certainly small and medium-sized apps, this is a great way to go. But don't use it forever, like everywhere, please. It has its use. If you don't need to share the state, don't make context. So for instance, here's some state. This state here, this is only needed by the login page. So there's no point in sharing the state. It's used by the component and no place else. It belongs in the component. So not all state should be shared, but the user, the current user, that does qualify as state that could be shared. And remember, we talked about even children and grandchildren of our component has access. Well, let's take a look. Even my counter will have access to the current user. Let's prove that. Because counter is a child of login, isn't it? And login is a child of app. And app is a child of index. And index is wrapped in our auth provider. So following our logic, our counter should actually have access to the current user. Easy to prove. That's just for fun. Let's go inside our counters. Let's go ahead and we'd never do this, of course, but we'll just import our auth context. Why not? And then we'll use our auth context. Let's use maybe the name, ID, username. Sure. We'll grab the name. So go to our counter and we'll use the context there. So we'll use our auth context. We don't need the logout for sure. And we'll just somewhere in our counter, we'll just stick the name, maybe between here. We'll put it right here. We'll say, give it maybe a span. Span. There we go. And we'll put the user.name. User.name. Of course, it's going to user.name because we forgot curly braces. So we'll do this. Users null. Oh, of course. Of course. Probably should do auth. I'll do auth instead. Oh no, I'll do a conditional rendering. Because of course in login, user's null. So I can't render user.name when I'm showing a login page. So I'll do a little bit of fancy conditional rendering to make this thing work. Hold on. I'll import the auth as well, my flag there. And I'll say auth and there, and that should do it. Okay, so now if there is an auth true, it'll show the name. Let's try it. This is like a live show, so you never know what's going to happen on live TV, right? And there we go, test user. So it does in fact happen. All children, grandchildren, in this case, great-grandchildren of the original wrapped component have access to that state. So all the way down the tree, this counter component, which is 3 or 4 levels down, still has access to my shared state by adding 2 lines of code. Import the context and then use it, and then decide what part of it you want to use. And it's magic. Quick discussion about it and Redux. For small and medium applications, this is the way to go. Seriously. Redux is a big stick. And when the useContext became more mainstream, people were saying things like, this is going to put Redux out of business. It's really, there's no need for Redux. And to a certain extent, that's true. This handles a lot of things very nicely, and you don't need Redux for small, medium-sized applications. There is one little gotcha, and let's take a look. Let's look at our app.js. It's not a problem. There's our counter provider. This is a component, isn't it? This component contains our shared state. It's just a component. It behaves just like a component would behave. What happens when the state of a component changes? Who can answer that question? What happens when a component state changes? What does the component do? Yes, the old re-render, which I can't say very well. Re-render, exactly, it renders again. It re-renders, which means if your state here changes, this component re-renders, and all of its children will re-render. That's how React is made. So this renders, and they all re-render. Now, in React, this is a in-memory render, which means the functions run again. We know the definition of re-render just means run the functions again. So, functions here. There's like 4 or 5 happening. So that is a counter. So like, I don't know, 6 functions, nothing. Nanosecond, maybe microsecond, really, really fast. So even for very, very large applications, we know that JavaScript can process tens of thousands of objects in the time it takes to write one eye on the screen, doesn't it? The cost to render that E is way more expensive, like in the browser itself, is way more expensive than processing 10, 20, 30,000 objects in your in-memory rendering. Because rendering in React terms is internally building your new virtual DOM. Then it goes ahead and puts it on the browser. So it would take an awfully large application to start becoming a problem using the context API. For small and medium's pretty big, context API will be fine for you. Redux does not have that re-render. They do a slightly, or not a totally different way of managing state. They put it literally off to the side. Here it's pushed up and it's wrapping. Redux uses a different paradigm. It's just off to the side. And it's a little different way of handling things. So they don't have that weakness, if you can call it that, of the re-render everything. But for small, medium applications, it's not a problem. And this is super simple compared to Redux. Redux, as I mentioned in the Slack, it's a big stick. So this is much easier. So, okay. All right, everyone. That is our talk on our context API. I do encourage you to grab the GitHub repo.